Greetings, YouTube. Today I'm going to be talking about the Lobster Coast, Rebels, Rusticators, and the Struggle for a Forgotten Frontier by Colin Woodard, who is himself a Mainer. And it's on the quote on the front, a thorough and engaging history of Maine's rocky coast and its tough-minded people, Boston Herald. And I'd have to say that was a fair assessment. This is a pretty hefty book, and it took me quite a bit to get through. Now, the book starts when the Europeans essentially show up in the early part of the 17th century. It does go into some of the history of the Native Americans that were, of course, had been there for 15,000 years. But I felt that it could have gone a little more depth in there. The author is at his best when he's talking about the people of the Maine coast. And it opens with a contemporary small island of lobster fishermen. And then it starts talking about the history of that little island. It's a little island. Like in the winter, it's got like 70 families on it, so it's not big. And then it goes into the history of that island, and then the history of the coast, and as the European invaders showed up, and their interactions with the natives, and the attempt by the British to essentially establish a very India-like structure where it would have been British lords ruling over a native population. Now that didn't work out, and it eventually became British citizens and immigrants from other parts of Europe showing up, but a lot of them were the Scots Irish and the Scots and things like that. A lot of the Germans showed up and populated different areas. And I wasn't aware, actually, of how tenuous a grip the Europeans had on the coast of Maine and how contentious the ruling of Maine was between their attempts to establish colonies in Maine and the fact that they eventually became a sub-colony to the colony in Massachusetts. Massachusetts ruled Maine for a very long time, and it cost a lot of bad blood. Not to mention the bad blood between the European invaders and the Native Americans. There were numerous wars. There were slaughters going in both directions. The Native Americans didn't do well once the Europeans introduced European diseases. It wiped out entire villages. It cut down the population by as much as 50% in some areas. It was just devastating. It was the beginning of what became the Native American genocide on this continent. And the author is at his best when he's talking about the people, both present and past, because he really was able to make me interested in the people from the 17th and 18th century. But as he got closer to our time, in the 19th century, it's almost like his connection to the people became more tenuous. And he began to put more raw data in and less human interest. Then we get into the 20th century and it just got worse. And as we got closer and closer to the end of the book, in many ways I became less and less interested. Now, I can handle a lot of data. Okay, I can read 19th century academic books written in Britain, which are very data heavy. And I can go through them, and I can even pick up some of the humor put in there by the British, which is as dry as my own. But it's like he was trying to make a point, and he made it. But then he gilded the lily. He just kept adding data. Okay, I get it. I got it. The flavor and the texture of Maine is being fundamentally changed as it's becoming urbanized. It's becoming suburban territories. As the coast is being turned into more of a park than a working waterfront for fishermen. He did talk. It was depressing when he talked about all the fish that were destroyed by the overfishing and the fact that the lobsters have really moved in and taken a place of them, and we still don't really understand why the lobsters have been doing so well. Some of it is because the lobster fishermen themselves have been very cautious. They have a double standard. Lobsters under a certain size get thrown back. Lobsters over a certain size get thrown back. And any big egg-laying females get notched in their tail and they get thrown back. And that notch survives molts. So they are not going to be taken even if they're in the range and eventually they would get big enough that they would not be taken even if the notch disappears from subsequent molts, which it probably will eventually. But they get that with that double gauge standard. When it gets above a certain size, they get thrown back in the ocean. And I reviewed a book here on this channel not that long ago, I don't remember how long ago, which dealt with lobsters in great detail. He deals with it in less detail, but it's interesting, and I think it's enough information for your average person to find out what they need to know about lobsters and their life cycle. The other book goes in far more depth, and I found it interesting, but a lot of people may not want that much depth of information on lobsters. This book is going to give you enough and not too much. It's one of the sections, at least I think he got the balance right. But when he starts talking about zoning laws and how things are changing and how the rusticators have moved in, vacationers, and have fundamentally changed the structure of Maine, and how when the retirees showed up and they're like, they want the flavor of Maine, but they don't want this noise of lobster boats going out at dawn. It bugs them. So they get the ordinance changed so that the lobster boats can't go out. So the lobster boats have to go elsewhere. Or they buy up so much of the land that the lobstermen themselves can't live at the coast anymore. Some of them are commuting for an hour inland just to get to their boat so they can go out, because the land has been bought up by real speculators or wealthy people. He talks about the classism, about the poor people in Maine and the wealthy people that come in for the summer for 3 months, or who have purchased $1 million homes that are there all the time, and they have the power to change the flavor and the structure and the culture of Maine itself. Now, my wife lived in Sanford, Maine for a little over a year, so I commuted on the weekends. Every other weekend I would go up to Sanford, Maine, and I tell you, the poverty is crushing in some areas. It really is depressing. They talked about this, about kids getting into like public school for the first time, and teacher finding out that these children had never eaten green vegetables, surviving on potatoes and pasta and what kind of meat products they could get from fishing or lobstering or clamming or hunting. I mean, just, it's depressing. And I saw some of that with myself. In fact, I knew a guy who grew up there in Sanford, Maine. I used to work with him. And if you pardon the vulgarity, he said there were 3 things you did in Sanford. You drank, you fought, or you fucked. That's it. And there were a lot of young pregnant people just in high school or just out of high school, because that's all they had. That's all they did. They didn't have any future. It was depressing like you would not believe. The one thing I think he failed at, because he talks about the Native Americans up and through the 18th century, and somehow the Native Americans just kind of fall off the radar in the book. The Native Americans are still there. I know. I'm friends with a family that lives in Sanford, Maine. My wife used to drum with them. I've been to their powwows that they themselves organized. So there are lots of Native Americans still there, but the author strangely doesn't talk about them like after the 18th century, which is weird, because they're part of the fabric of Maine. And I think that their existence is important. Even if they cease to play a major political role, they're still there and they're still important. So it was a good book. It was interesting. I wish that he had handed this to a better editor, because I think if you had shaved off like 40 pages, you could have tightened this thing up, maybe made up a little bit with some more information about the Native Americans, less about zoning laws, and you would have had a better book. But it does make me wonder what else he's written, so I'm going to probably look him up and see what else he's written. And I seriously might be intrigued to see if he did better with other topics, or did he do the same thing where he gets lost in the data to a certain extent. Because if he stayed talking about the people, I think he would have been better off. So a good book, just an imperfect book. Well, then again, who isn't? But definitely, if you're into Maine, read The Lobster Coast. I'm going to be mailing this to a friend of mine because he lives in Maine, and he might find it interesting because I don't need it anymore. But yeah, quite interesting, and frankly, it made me want to eat lobster.